Welcome back to Her True Stories, where we share the most incredible tales of women who turned their pain into power and their betrayal into triumph. I'm about to tell you a story that will absolutely blow your mind. It's about a grandmother's love, a $33 million fortune, and revenge so perfectly crafted it's almost poetic. But before we dive into this emotional roller coaster, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because stories like this are exactly why this channel exists. Trust me, you're going to want to share this one with every woman in your life who needs to remember her worth. Now, let's get into Michelle's incredible journey. The morning of May 15 started like any other spring day. The sun was warm but not overwhelming. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and children's laughter echoed from the playground at Riverside Park. I had suggested this family picnic to celebrate Michael's 8th birthday. My precious grandson, the light of my life since my dear Arthur, had passed 2 years ago. I arrived early, spreading out the red checkered blanket I'd used for family gatherings for over 30 years. The same blanket where Sarah had taken her first steps, where we'd celebrated countless birthdays, where Arthur and I had shared quiet moments watching our family grow. Today, I'd packed all of Michael's favorites: peanut butter and jelly sandwiches cut into triangles, apple slices with caramel dip, and homemade chocolate chip cookies that still warm from the oven. Grandma! Michael's voice cut through the park's ambient noise like a ray of sunshine. He broke free from Sarah and Mark's grip and ran toward me with the unbridled enthusiasm that only an 8-year-old can possess. His sandy brown hair caught the sunlight as he threw himself into my arms, and I held him close, breathing in that sweet scent of childhood, grass stains, soap, and pure innocence. "Happy birthday, my darling boy," I whispered, feeling my heart swell with the kind of love that had sustained me through the darkest days since Arthur's death. "Did you bring the cookies?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Of course I did. What kind of grandmother would I be if I forgot your birthday cookies?" He giggled and hugged me tighter. The best grandma in the whole world. Those words. Those precious, innocent words that would soon become the catalyst for everything that followed. Sarah and Mark approached more slowly, their expressions unreadable. My daughter looked beautiful as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her sundress coordinated with Michael's outfit. But there was something cold in her green eyes, something that had been growing colder since Arthur's funeral, when the lawyer had read his will. Mark walked beside her with that confident stride that had once charmed me when he first started dating Sarah 15 years ago. He was handsome in a conventional way, tall, athletic, with the kind of smile that sold insurance policies and closed business deals. But lately, that smile never quite reached his eyes when he looked at me. "Hello, Mother," Sarah said, leaning in for the obligatory hug. Her embrace was brief, perfunctory, lacking the warmth we'd once shared. "Michelle," Mark nodded, not bothering with physical affection. "Thanks for organizing this." "My pleasure," I replied, though something in his tone made me uneasy. "Should we get started? I've packed quite a feast." The first hour passed pleasantly enough. Michael regaled us with stories from school, his excitement about his new bicycle, and his plans for summer vacation. I listened with rapt attention, soaking up every word, every gesture, every moment with my grandson. Since Arthur's death, these moments had become even more precious to me. But I noticed things. The way Mark kept checking his watch. The way Sarah kept glancing around the park as if she was expecting someone or looking for an escape route. The way they exchanged meaningful looks when they thought I wasn't paying attention. "Grandma, can we go feed the ducks?" Michael asked, pointing toward the small pond where families were scattered on benches, tossing breadcrumbs to the eager waterfowl. "Of course, sweetheart. Let me get the bread I brought." "I'll take him," Mark said quickly, standing up and brushing grass from his khakis. "You stay here and rest, Michelle." There was something in his tone, a dismissiveness that I'd been noticing more and more lately. As if I was an elderly woman who needed to be managed rather than Michael's grandmother, who deserved respect. "I'd like to come too," I said gently. "I enjoy watching Michael feed the ducks." "Actually," Sarah interjected, "we wanted to talk to you about something." "Mark, why don't you take Michael to the ducks, and we'll catch up in a few minutes?" Mark nodded, extending his hand to Michael. "Come on, buddy. Let's go see those ducks." "Can Grandma come?" Michael asked innocently. And that's when it happened. That's when my world shifted on its axis. Mark's face darkened, his jaw tightening with sudden anger. "Never call her Grandma," he snapped, his voice loud enough that several nearby families turned to stare. "She is not your grandma. Your real grandma is dead." Michael's face crumpled in confusion and hurt. But she is my grandma," Mommy said. "Your mother was wrong," Mark continued, his voice growing harsher. "This woman is nothing to you. You don't have anything here anyway." The words hit me like physical blows. The cruelty in his voice, the deliberate intent to hurt not just me but an innocent child, was breathtaking in its viciousness. But what destroyed me completely was looking at Sarah. My daughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep, whose scraped knees I'd kissed, whose dreams I'd nurtured, was smiling. Not a gentle, apologetic smile of someone uncomfortable with their spouse's behavior. No, this was a cold, satisfied smile. Triumphant, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. The park seemed to fall silent around us. Other families were staring now, witnessing this public humiliation. Some looked shocked, others embarrassed for us. A few mothers instinctively pulled their own children closer, as if cruelty might be contagious. Michael began to cry. Big, silent tears that rolled down his flushed cheeks. He looked back and forth between his father and me, his 8-year-old mind trying to process why the adults in his life were saying such horrible things. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Grandma, why is Daddy being mean?" Before I could respond, Mark grabbed Michael's hand roughly. "Don't call her that. Come on, we're leaving." "But the picnic," Michael protested. "The picnic is over," Sarah said, standing and brushing off her dress. She looked at me with those cold green eyes. "I think we've all said enough for one day." They packed up their things quickly, leaving me sitting on that red checkered blanket surrounded by the birthday feast I'd prepared with such love. Michael kept looking back at me as Mark dragged him away, his little face streaked with tears and confusion. I sat there for a long time after they left, watching the ducks glide peacefully across the pond, listening to the laughter of other families enjoying their perfect Sunday afternoon. But inside me, something fundamental had shifted. The grief I'd carried since Arthur's death, the loneliness, the sense of being adrift, all of it crystallized into something harder, colder, more focused. They had humiliated me in public. They had used an innocent child as a weapon. They had shown me exactly who they really were, and I was going to show them exactly who I really was. That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed, not for forgiveness or understanding, but for guidance, for wisdom, for the strength to do what needed to be done. Arthur had always said that I was stronger than I knew. It was time to find out if he was right. 3 days passed before I called Sarah. 3 days of careful planning, of consulting with my lawyer, of praying for guidance and strength. When I finally picked up the phone, my voice was steady, calm, almost pleasant. "Sarah, darling, I was wondering if you and Mark would like to come for dinner this Friday evening. I have something important to discuss with you both." There was a pause on the other end of the line. What kind of something? Family matters. Financial planning. The future. I kept my tone light, almost casual. "I think it's time we had a serious conversation about Michael's inheritance." Another pause, longer this time. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, the greed awakening like a sleeping dragon. Of course, mother. What time should we be there? 7 o'clock. And Sarah? Please arrange for Michael to stay with a friend that evening. This conversation is for adults only. I understand. Oh, but she didn't. She had no idea what she'd set in motion at that picnic. No conception of what was coming. Friday evening arrived with a crispness that suggested autumn was approaching. I spent the day preparing meticulously, not just the meal, but every detail of what would unfold. I chose my outfit carefully, a navy blue dress that Arthur had always said made me look distinguished, my grandmother's pearls, and the diamond earrings Arthur had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look every inch the wealthy widow they thought they could manipulate. The dining room was set with my finest china, the Wedgwood pattern that had been my mother's, that I'd planned to pass down to Sarah someday. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier Arthur had insisted on buying when we'd remodeled 10 years ago. Everything was perfect, elegant, befitting a woman of means discussing her $33 million fortune. They arrived precisely at 7, Mark in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, Sarah in a black cocktail dress that hugged her figure perfectly. They looked like the successful young couple they appeared to be, attractive, polished, confident. "Mother, you look wonderful," Sarah said, kissing my cheek. The gesture felt calculated, performed for Mark's benefit. "Thank you, darling. You both look lovely. How was your week?" Small talk flowed easily as we moved through the appetizer course. Mark complimented the wine, a 2015 Bordeaux from Arthur's carefully curated collection. Sarah praised the salmon, though she barely touched it. The tension at the table was palpable, though they tried to hide their anticipation behind polite conversation. Finally, as I cleared the main course plates, I decided it was time. "I asked you here tonight because I wanted to discuss something very important," I began, settling back into my chair at the head of the table. "As you know, Arthur left me quite comfortable. The estate is worth approximately $33 million. Mark's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Sarah's breathing became almost imperceptibly quicker. "I've been thinking a great deal about legacy lately, about what really matters, about family." I paused, letting the word hang in the air. "And I've made a decision about my will." "Mother, you don't need to," Sarah started, but I held up my hand. "Please let me finish. This is important." I took a sip of wine, savoring the moment. "Tonight, I want to tell you about the heir to my $33 million fortune." Mark had gone visibly pale, though he tried to hide it by reaching for his water glass. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her green eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "I've decided," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "that my beloved grandson, Michael, will be the sole heir to my entire fortune." The relief that washed over Mark's face was almost comical. His shoulders relaxed, and he exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Sarah. I could see the calculations running through their heads. $33 million, controlled by them as Michael's parents until he came of age. They thought they'd won. That's wonderful, Mother," Sarah said, though her voice was carefully modulated. "Michael is so young, though. I assume you've considered how the inheritance would be managed." "Oh, yes," I replied. "I've considered everything very carefully." Mark cleared his throat. "Michelle, we want you to know that Sarah and I would take our responsibility as Michael's guardians very seriously. We'd make sure the money was invested wisely, used for his education, his future." "I'm sure you would," I said softly. "But there's something else you need to know about Michael's inheritance." They leaned forward slightly, like predators sensing their prey. "Something else?" Sarah asked. I smiled, a gentle, grandmotherly smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Yes, darling. You see, Michael's access to this fortune comes with certain conditions. Conditions that you, Mark, and you, Sarah, must fulfill on his behalf." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see them processing my words, trying to understand what I'd just said. Conditions? Mark repeated slowly. Oh yes. Very specific conditions. You see, after what happened at the picnic last Sunday, I realized that Michael needs protection. Not just from financial predators, but from people who might not have his best interests at heart. Sarah's face had gone white. Mother, what are you talking about? I'm talking about a man who would tell an 8-year-old boy that his grandmother isn't really his grandmother. I'm talking about a woman who would sit there smiling while her own child was emotionally abused. I'm talking about two people who seem to believe that cruelty has no consequences. Mark started to speak, but I continued. So, I've established certain requirements that must be met before Michael can access his inheritance. Think of them as character development exercises. What kind of requirements? Mark's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. I smiled again, wider this time. I'm so glad you asked. I rose from my chair and walked to the sideboard where I'd placed a leather portfolio. Inside were documents that had taken my lawyer and me 3 days to perfect, every word chosen carefully, every clause designed to be both legally binding and personally devastating. The first condition, I said, opening the portfolio and reading from the top document, is a public apology. A what? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Mark and Sarah must issue a formal, televised public apology to both myself and Michael, detailing the cruel actions that took place at Riverside Park on May 15th. This apology must be broadcast on at least 3 local television stations and published in the city's major newspaper. Mark's face was turning red. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm completely serious. But that's just the beginning. I turned to the next page. The second condition involves community service. You must collectively perform 1,000 hours of community service at Little Angels Children's Charity, the organization that supports neglected and emotionally abused children. You'll submit weekly reports on your progress, which will be made public on the charity's website. This is insane, Mark muttered, but I continued reading. The third condition requires complete financial transparency. Mark, you must submit to a full, independent audit of all your personal and business finances. The findings will be released to the media and made part of public record. You can't force me to. And the fourth condition, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, requires Sarah to spend 1 full year as a public advocate for grandparents' rights. You'll speak at conferences, lobby for legislation, and publicly campaign for laws protecting grandparent-grandchild relationships. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Mark and Sarah stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. Finally, Mark found his voice. This is blackmail. No, I replied calmly. This is justice. You want access to my money? You want to control my grandson's inheritance? Then you'll earn it. We'll never do this, Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury. This is humiliating, degrading. Yes, I agreed. It is. Rather like telling an 8-year-old boy that his grandmother isn't really his grandmother. Rather like smiling while your husband emotionally abuses your own child. One mistake, Mark shouted, standing so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. You're going to destroy our lives over one mistake? One mistake, I repeated, my voice deadly quiet. Is that what you call deliberately hurting an innocent child? Is that what you call the look of satisfaction on Sarah's face when you humiliated me in front of dozens of strangers? Sarah was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustrated rage. You're crazy. You're a vindictive old woman who has $33 million, I finished for her. Who has the power to ensure that her grandson grows up understanding the difference between love and manipulation. Who refuses to let cruelty go unpunished. We won't do it, Mark declared. We'll fight this. We'll contest the will. We'll. You'll what? I asked pleasantly. Take me to court? Explain to a judge why you believe you're entitled to money that isn't yours? Describe in legal proceedings how you told an 8-year-old that his grandmother wasn't really his grandmother. I walked back to my chair and sat down, smoothing my skirt with hands that didn't tremble. By all means, contest the will. But you should know that every condition I've outlined is perfectly legal. My lawyer has been very thorough. You see, I'm not giving you my money. I'm giving it to Michael. You simply have the opportunity to ensure he receives it. And if we refuse? Sarah asked through her tears. Then Michael will still receive his inheritance, but not until he turns 35 instead of 25. And in the meantime, the money will be held in trust, with myself and 3 other trustees managing it. You'll have no access to it whatsoever. The implications hit them like a sledgehammer. No access to the money. No financial security. No easy path to wealth. You evil bitch, Mark snarled. Language, Mark, I said mildly. There's no need for profanity. This is simply cause and effect. You chose to be cruel to an innocent child. Now you're experiencing the consequences of that choice. They left shortly after that, Mark muttering threats about lawyers and Sarah sobbing into her hands. But I knew they'd be back. $33 million has a way of making people reconsider their principles. I sat alone in my dining room, surrounded by the detritus of what had once been a family dinner, and felt something I hadn't experienced since Arthur's death. Peace. Not happiness, exactly, but the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've acted with purpose. They thought they could intimidate me, humiliate me, dismiss me as a harmless old woman. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The next morning, I called Eleanor Vance, the lawyer who had handled Arthur's estate and who had become not just my legal counsel, but a trusted friend. Eleanor was a woman of sharp intelligence and unshakable integrity, qualities that had served her well in 30 years of practice. Michelle, she said when I called, I've been expecting to hear from you. How did they take the news about the conditions? About as well as you'd expect. Mark called me an evil bitch, and Sarah cried. They'll be contesting everything, of course. Let them try. We've been very careful about the legal framework. Everything is ironclad. Eleanor's voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a case she cared about. The conditions are challenging but not impossible, humiliating but not illegal. More importantly, they're directly related to the behavior that triggered them. What about their threats to fight it in court? They can try, but they'll lose. You're under no legal obligation to leave them anything. The money is yours to dispose of as you see fit. If you want to give it to Michael with conditions, that's entirely within your rights. That afternoon, I drove to Grace Methodist Church, where I'd been a member for over 20 years. Pastor Williams was a kind man who had officiated at Arthur's funeral and had been a source of comfort during my darkest days. Mrs. Robb, he said when I knocked on his office door. What a pleasant surprise. How are you holding up? I'm well, Pastor. Actually, I was wondering if I could speak with you about organizing a prayer group. I'm facing some family challenges, and I could use the spiritual support. Within a week, I had assembled a group of 12 women from the congregation, all women of faith who understood the importance of family bonds and the pain of betrayal. I told them my story, not mentioning names initially, but sharing the details of what had happened at the picnic and the steps I was taking in response. Sister, said Margaret Foster, a widow in her 70s who had raised 6 children, that man had no right to speak to you that way, especially in front of the child. No right at all. The child is the innocent one in all this, added Patricia Chen, whose own daughter lived across the country. He shouldn't be caught in the middle of adult conflicts. But he is in the middle, I replied. And if I don't protect him now, who will? If I let this behavior go unpunished, what message does that send? The women nodded in understanding. They had all experienced family conflicts, had all faced moments when they had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for what was right. "What you're doing takes courage," said Eleanor. "Not my lawyer, but Eleanor Hartwell, a retired teacher. Standing up to family is the hardest thing in the world." "But necessary," added Margaret. "Sometimes love means setting boundaries. Sometimes it means consequences." We prayed together that evening, not for revenge, but for wisdom, for strength, for protection for Michael, and for the hearts of Mark and Sarah to be changed. But I also prayed for something else, for the courage to see this through, no matter how difficult it became. Meanwhile, Mark and Sarah were indeed consulting their own lawyers. I knew this because Eleanor had contacts throughout the legal community, and word traveled fast when someone was shopping around for representation in a case involving $33 million. "They've been to 4 different firms," Eleanor reported during our meeting on Thursday. "Each one has told them the same thing. The conditions are legal, the will is valid, and they have no grounds for a successful challenge." "How are they taking that news?" "Not well, from what I hear. Mark's been calling the conditions extortion and elder abuse. Sarah's been crying and claiming you've lost your mind with grief. Have they considered simply fulfilling the conditions?" Eleanor laughed, a sound without humor. "Apparently, that option hasn't occurred to them. They seem to believe they can bully you into changing your mind or find a legal loophole that will give them the money without the requirements. They're in for a long wait." "Yes, they are." That evening, I received my first phone call from Sarah since the dinner. "Mother, please. We need to talk about this reasonably." "I'm always reasonable, darling. What would you like to discuss?" "These conditions. They're impossible. The public apology alone would destroy Mark's business reputation." "Would it? Or would it simply require him to take responsibility for his actions?" "You don't understand. His clients, his partners, they'd never take him seriously again if he had to go on television and apologize for something that happened at a family picnic." "Something that happened?" I repeated. "Sarah, he emotionally abused an 8-year-old child. He humiliated me in public. He told Michael that I wasn't his grandmother. Do you really think that's something that just happened? He was having a bad day. He's been under a lot of stress." "Stop." My voice cut through her excuses like a blade. "Just stop. There is no excuse for what he did. None. And there is absolutely no excuse for you sitting there smiling while he did it." "I wasn't smiling. Don't lie to me, Sarah. I saw your face. I saw the satisfaction in your eyes. You enjoyed watching him hurt me." The silence stretched between us for long moments. "What do you want from us?" she finally asked, her voice small and defeated. "I want you to earn the privilege of accessing my grandson's inheritance. I want you to demonstrate that you understand the difference between right and wrong. I want you to show Michael that actions have consequences and that cruelty doesn't pay. And if we can't, if we won't, then you'll live with the consequences of that choice, just like I'm living with the consequences of yours." She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I knelt beside my bed and prayed again. Not for their hearts to change. I was beginning to understand that some people are incapable of genuine change. Instead, I prayed for strength to protect Michael, for wisdom to navigate the battles ahead, and for peace in the knowledge that I was fighting for something greater than money. I was fighting for the principle that cruelty should have consequences, that children should be protected, that love should triumph over greed. And I was prepared to fight as long as it took. 2 weeks passed before Mark and Sarah made their decision. 2 weeks of heated arguments, frantic lawyer consultations, and desperate attempts to find another way. But $33 million is a powerful motivator, and their own financial situation, while comfortable, wasn't nearly enough to sustain the lifestyle they'd become accustomed to. Sarah called on a Tuesday morning, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "We'll do it," she said without preamble. "Do what, darling?" "The conditions. The requirements. We'll fulfill them. All of them." "Yes, all of them." I felt a flutter of something that might have been disappointment. Part of me had hoped they would refuse, that they would choose their pride over the money and walk away. It would have been cleaner somehow, more honest. "When would you like to begin?" "As soon as possible. Mark wants to get this over with. The public apology will need to be arranged first. I'll have Eleanor contact the television stations and newspaper. Shall we say this Friday at noon? That should give the media time to promote it properly." Another pause. "This Friday? Unless you'd prefer to wait longer? The sooner we begin, the sooner the process will be complete." "No. Friday is fine." That Friday, Channel 7's noon news broadcast featured a segment that would be replayed on social media for months to come. Mark and Sarah sat rigidly in the studio chairs, both pale and clearly uncomfortable. The news anchor, Janet Morrison, introduced the segment with barely concealed curiosity. "We have with us today Mark and Sarah Robb, who have requested airtime to make a public apology regarding a family incident. Mr. Robb." Mark looked directly into the camera, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching. "On May 15th, at Riverside Park, I spoke inappropriately to my mother-in-law, Michelle Robb, in front of my 8-year-old son. I told the child that Mrs. Robb was not his grandmother, and that he had nothing there. This was cruel, unnecessary, and wrong." The words sounded rehearsed, mechanical, completely devoid of genuine remorse. "Mrs. Robb," Janet prompted. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I was present during this incident and failed to intervene. I failed to protect both my mother and my son from emotional harm. I apologize for my silence and my complicity." "Can you tell us what prompted this public apology?" Janet asked. Mark's face flushed red. "It's a family matter. A private family matter that we're resolving privately. Yet you've chosen to make this apology public?" "Yes." "May I ask why?" Another long pause. Sarah answered this time. "Because sometimes accountability needs to be public. Because actions have consequences." The interview lasted 10 minutes, and every second of it was painful to watch, even for me. But it was also necessary. Michael needed to see that his father was capable of admitting wrongdoing, even if that admission was forced. The community needed to understand that cruelty toward elderly family members wouldn't be tolerated. The reaction was swift and brutal. By that afternoon, the video had been shared thousands of times on social media. Comments ranged from supportive, "Good for the grandmother for standing up for herself," to harsh, "What kind of man tells a kid his grandma isn't his grandma?" to speculative, "There's definitely more to this story." Mark's business partner called him that same afternoon. 3 clients canceled meetings. His country club membership was temporarily suspended pending review. But the community service portion proved even more challenging for them. Little Angels Children's Charity was an organization I'd supported for years. A group that provided counseling and support services for children who had experienced emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. The director, Maria Santos, was a woman who had dedicated her life to protecting vulnerable children. "Mrs. Robb," she said when I called to arrange Mark and Sarah's volunteer work, "I have to ask, are you sure about this? We work with traumatized children here. We need volunteers who are genuinely committed to the cause." "I understand your concerns, Maria, but sometimes people need to see the consequences of their actions up close. Sometimes they need to understand the pain they've caused by witnessing similar pain in others. And if they're not suitable, if they can't handle the work, or if they're disruptive, then that becomes part of their public record. The community will see exactly what kind of people they really are." Mark and Sarah's first day at Little Angels was a disaster. They arrived late, dressed inappropriately, Mark in an expensive suit, Sarah in designer jeans and heels, and with attitudes that made clear they considered this beneath them. "What exactly are we supposed to do here?" Mark asked Maria, looking around the modest facility with obvious distaste. "Today you'll be helping with our after-school program. We have 30 children ages 6 to 12 who come here while their parents work. Many of them are dealing with trauma, so patience and kindness are essential." "Trauma?" Sarah asked nervously. "These children have experienced abuse, neglect, family violence. They're here because this is the safest place in their lives." I watched from across the street as Mark and Sarah reluctantly entered the building. 2 hours later, they emerged looking shell-shocked. Mark was actually pale, and Sarah had clearly been crying. Their supervisor that day later told Maria that Mark had lost his temper with a 7-year-old boy who was acting out, raising his voice and demanding the child behave himself. Sarah had spent most of the time hiding in the bathroom, overwhelmed by the children's stories and their obvious emotional pain. They lasted exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes, Maria reported to me that evening. "I've never seen volunteers leave so quickly. Will you allow them to return? They're required to, aren't they? But Mrs. Robb, I need you to understand. If they can't handle this work with compassion and respect, they'll be asked to leave permanently. I won't allow anyone to further traumatize these children. I wouldn't want you to." The local newspaper's coverage of their community service was equally damaging. The reporter had interviewed several staff members, with their permission, of course, about the new volunteers. They seemed surprised that the work was actually difficult. One counselor was quoted as saying, "As if they expected to just show up and check boxes." "The children could tell immediately that these weren't people who wanted to be there," added another. "Children who've been hurt are very sensitive to insincerity." But perhaps the most telling moment came during their 3rd week at Little Angels, when 8-year-old Tommy, a boy whose father had abandoned the family 2 years earlier, asked Sarah a simple question. "Are you somebody's mommy?" "Yes," Sarah replied carefully. "I have a little boy about your age." "Does he have a grandma?" Sarah's face went white. "Yes, he does." "Is she nice?" The pause that followed was captured by a volunteer who happened to be recording activities for the charity's newsletter. Sarah's struggle to answer a child's innocent question about grandmother's kindness became a viral moment that encapsulated everything wrong with their situation. "Yes," Sarah finally whispered. "She's very nice." "I wish I had a nice grandma," Tommy said wistfully. That video clip was viewed over 1 million times. By the end of their first month of community service, the strain was showing in every aspect of Mark and Sarah's lives. The public humiliation, the physical and emotional demands of working with traumatized children, and the constant media attention were taking their toll. Their marriage, which I now realized had probably been struggling for some time, began to fracture under the pressure. "This is all your fault," I heard Mark yelling when I drove past their house one evening. Their voices carried clearly through the open windows of their Tudor-style home, the house they bought with money from Arthur's life insurance policy. "My fault." Sarah's voice was shrill with exhaustion and rage. "You're the one who couldn't keep your mouth shut at that picnic. You're the one who had to be cruel to an old woman. An old woman who's destroying our lives. She's my mother. Some mother. What kind of woman tortures her own daughter like this? What kind of man tells an 8-year-old that his grandmother isn't his grandmother?" The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of something crashing, a glass, perhaps, or a picture frame. Their social circle had already begun to distance themselves. The country club had made Mark's suspension permanent after several members complained about the negative publicity. Sarah's book club had restructured, and somehow forgot to invite her to the new meetings. Even their neighbors had started avoiding eye contact when they passed on the street. Questionable deductions for personal items claimed as business expenses. When the local business journal published a summary of these findings, Mark's remaining clients began jumping ship. His insurance agency, built over 15 years of networking and relationship building, began to crumble. He's been taking advantage of elderly clients, one former customer told the reporter. Selling them policies they didn't need, charging fees that weren't properly disclosed. Makes you wonder what else he's been hiding. But perhaps most painful for Sarah was her required advocacy work for grandparents' rights. Speaking at conferences and community meetings about the importance of grandparent-grandchild relationships while being publicly known as the woman who had allowed her husband to emotionally abuse her own mother created a level of cognitive dissonance that was clearly destroying her. Mrs. Robb makes important points about the legal protections grandparents need, wrote one vlogger after Sarah's presentation at a family law conference, but one has to wonder about the sincerity of someone who failed to protect her own mother from her husband's cruelty. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Sarah herself. She was advocating for the very rights she had helped violate, speaking about the importance of relationships she had stood by and watched being destroyed. I attended one of her presentations, sitting in the back of the community center auditorium where she couldn't see me. She looked haggard, exhausted, reading from prepared remarks with no passion or conviction. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, an elderly man in the front row raised his hand. "Ms. Robb, you speak eloquently about the importance of grandparent rights, but I understand you've had some personal experience with this issue. Can you share what motivated your advocacy?" Sarah's face went white. She gripped the podium with both hands, her knuckles showing clearly against her pale skin. Personal experience has taught me that family relationships are precious and fragile, that they need protection under the law, that children benefit from having loving grandparents in their lives. "But didn't your own husband?" "I'm here to discuss legislation," Sarah interrupted, her voice shaking. "Not personal matters." "But surely your personal experience informs your advocacy?"
Yes.
"Yes, it does. It's taught me that sometimes people make mistakes, that sometimes those mistakes have consequences, and that sometimes the law needs to step in to protect the innocent." She left immediately after her presentation, not staying for the networking session that was supposed to follow. 3 months into their public penance, Michael called me. "Grandma?" His voice was small, uncertain. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?"
"Dad."
"Mommy and Daddy are fighting all the time. And Daddy says mean things about you." My heart broke for him. This innocent child was caught in the middle of a war he couldn't understand, suffering because the adults in his life couldn't behave with basic decency. "I'm sorry to hear that, Michael. Do you want to come visit me?" "Daddy says I can't. He says you're trying to hurt our family." "What do you think?" A long pause. "I think you're my grandma and I love you. I don't understand why Daddy was so mean at the picnic." Sometimes adults make bad choices, sweetheart. And sometimes when people make bad choices, there are consequences. What's consequences? It means that when you do something wrong, something bad might happen because of it. Like if you don't do your homework, you might get a bad grade. Are Mommy and Daddy getting bad grades? Out of the mouths of babes. In a way, yes. They're learning that being mean to people has consequences. Will they stop being mean? I hope so, Michael. I really hope so. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that Mark and Sarah weren't learning. They weren't growing. They were simply enduring, counting down the hours until their public humiliation would end and they could access Michael's inheritance. At their weekly community service sessions, they arrived late, left early when possible, and did the bare minimum required. The children at Little Angels had stopped trying to connect with them after it became obvious that Mark and Sarah viewed them as obstacles rather than human beings deserving of compassion. "They're going through the motions," Maria Santos told me during one of our monthly check-ins. "They're fulfilling the letter of the law, but not the spirit. These children need volunteers who care about them, not people who are just serving time." "Are they harming the children?" "Not directly. but they're not helping them either. They're just there, taking up space, radiating resentment. The media coverage continued to be brutal. Every public appearance, every community service session, every awkward moment was documented and analyzed. Social media had dubbed them the apology couple, and their story had become a cautionary tale about family dysfunction and public accountability. What started as a grandmother's quest for justice has become a masterclass in public shaming, wrote one columnist. But one has to ask, when does accountability become cruelty? I read that column 3 times, wondering if the writer might be right. Was I being cruel? Was I taking this too far? But then I remembered Michael's tears at the picnic. I remembered Sarah's satisfied smile as Mark told an 8-year-old that his grandmother wasn't his grandmother. I remembered the deliberate, calculated cruelty of that moment.
No.
This wasn't cruelty. This was justice. This was consequences. This was a lesson that some people could only learn through public humiliation because they were incapable of private shame. By month 6, Mark's business had collapsed entirely. The combination of negative publicity, client defections, and the ongoing financial audit had made it impossible for him to maintain his insurance agency. He was forced to close the office and lay off his 3 employees. Rob Insurance Services has ceased operations, read the notice in the business section of the local paper. Owner Mark Robb cited personal circumstances as the reason for the closure. But the real reason was clear to everyone who had been following their story. Mark had become toxic in the business community. His name was associated with elder abuse, public humiliation, and questionable financial practices. No one wanted to work with him, invest with him, or even be seen with him. Sarah fared little better. Her advocacy work had become a laughingstock in legal circles. Lawyers referred to pulling a Sarah Robb when describing situations where someone advocated for positions completely at odds with their own behavior. She's become a cautionary tale, one family law attorney told a reporter. A perfect example of how not to handle grandparent-grandchild conflicts. Their financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Without Mark's business income, and with their savings depleted by legal fees and the costs of maintaining their lifestyle during the public crisis, they were forced to put their house on the market. The realtor they hired was blunt about their prospects. "The house is beautiful," she told them, "but the association with your situation is going to affect the price. Some buyers won't want to be connected to this story, even tangentially." The house that had been appraised at $850,000 18 months earlier was now struggling to attract offers above $650,000. But perhaps the most devastating blow came when Michael's school counselor called Child Protective Services. "We're concerned about the emotional impact this situation is having on Michael," the counselor, Mrs. Patterson, explained to the social worker. "He's been acting out in class, his grades have dropped, and he's expressed confusion and distress about the family conflict." The CPS investigation was brief but thorough. The caseworker interviewed Michael, observed his interactions with Mark and Sarah, and reviewed the extensive media coverage of their situation. While we found no evidence of direct abuse or neglect, the final report stated, "The child is clearly suffering emotional distress as a result of the ongoing family conflict and public scrutiny. We recommend family counseling and a reduction in the child's exposure to media coverage of the situation." The report was leaked to the press, of course. Everything in their lives had become public property. "Child welfare officials investigate. Apology couple," ran the headline in the city's largest newspaper. That night, Sarah called me. She was crying before she even spoke. "Mother, please. This has to stop." "What is to stop, darling?" "Equals. All of it. The community service, the advocacy work, the media attention. It's destroying our family." "Your family was destroyed at a picnic 6 months ago, Sarah. I'm simply making sure the destruction is complete. Michael is suffering. The school counselor says he's having nightmares. He's afraid to bring friends home because they might see us on the news. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you decided to humiliate him in public. We made a mistake. People make mistakes. No, I said firmly. You made a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice to be cruel to an innocent child and to humiliate an elderly woman. Now you're experiencing the consequences of that choice. What do you want from us? Blood? Our lives? Our souls? I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to learn that cruelty isn't acceptable just because the victim is old or powerless. I want you to demonstrate to Michael that there's a difference between right and wrong. And if we're not the people you want us to be, then you'll continue to be exactly what you are. Examples of what happens when people choose selfishness over love, greed over decency, cruelty over kindness. The conversation ended with Sarah sobbing into the phone. The next morning, I drove past their house and saw a moving truck in the driveway. They were relocating to a smaller rental property across town, a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex known primarily for housing people going through divorces or financial difficulties. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The couple who had once lived in relative luxury, who had thought themselves entitled to my fortune, were now struggling to make rent. But even as their public humiliation reached new depths, they continued to show no genuine remorse. Their apologies remained scripted and hollow. Their community service was performed with visible resentment. Their advocacy work was delivered without passion or conviction. They were going through the motions, enduring their punishment, but learning nothing from it. And that's when I realized that some people are incapable of genuine change. Some people will never understand the harm they cause because they're fundamentally unable to see beyond their own wants and needs. Mark and Sarah weren't becoming better people through this process. They were simply becoming more careful about hiding their true nature. As their public ordeal stretched into its 8th month, I began to worry more seriously about Michael. The child who had once run to me with joy and called me the best grandma in the whole world was now an anxious, withdrawn 8-year-old caught in the center of an adult conflict he couldn't understand. I arranged to meet with Mrs. Patterson, his school counselor, to discuss his well-being. Michael is struggling, she told me bluntly. His academic performance has declined, he's having trouble sleeping, and he's become increasingly isolated from his classmates. The other children know about his family's situation. It's been impossible to shield him from it completely. How can I help him? He needs stability. He needs to know that at least some of the adults in his life can be trusted to act in his best interests rather than their own. What do you recommend? Supervised visits, perhaps. Somewhere neutral where he can spend time with you without feeling like he's betraying his parents or getting caught in the middle of the conflict. I thought about this carefully. Michael's welfare had always been my primary concern, but I was beginning to realize that protecting him might require a different approach than the one I'd been taking. That weekend, I arranged for Michael to spend Saturday afternoon with me at the Children's Museum. Neutral territory where we could be together without the charged atmosphere of family homes or public spaces where we might be recognized. "Grandma," he said quietly as we looked at the dinosaur exhibit, "why are Mommy and Daddy always angry now?" I knelt down so we were at eye level. This conversation had been inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. "Do you remember what happened at the picnic, sweetheart? When Daddy said, 'I wasn't your grandmother?'" His face scrunched up with the effort of remembering. "He was mean to you. It made me sad." It made me sad too. And when people are mean to others, sometimes there are consequences. Like getting in trouble? Yes, like getting in trouble. Your parents are learning that being mean to people has consequences. Are you punishing them? The directness of his question caught me off guard. Children have a way of cutting through adult complexity to reach the heart of matters. In a way, yes, but not to be mean to them. To help them learn that they can't treat people badly without consequences. Will they learn? I wished I could give him a more optimistic answer. I hope so, Michael. I really hope so. But sometimes adults have trouble learning new things. Are you still my grandma? I will always be your grandma, sweetheart. Always. No matter what anyone says or does, nothing can change that. Over the following weeks, I began implementing a different strategy. Instead of simply watching Mark and Sarah fail at their public requirements, I started creating positive alternatives for Michael. I established a trust fund specifically for his education and well-being that would be available regardless of his parents' performance. I arranged for him to spend time with other family members, Arthur's sister Margaret, who lived in the next state, and my own cousin Helen, who had children Michael's age. Most importantly, I began working with a family therapist to help Michael process his feelings about the situation. Children need to understand that family conflicts are not their fault, Dr. Rebecca Martinez explained during our first meeting. Michael is carrying guilt about the situation because he called you grandma at the picnic. He thinks he caused all of this. How do we help him understand that it's not his fault? By giving him age-appropriate information about adult choices and consequences. By helping him see that he's loved and valued regardless of what's happening between the other adults in his life. Through therapy and our carefully supervised visits, Michael gradually began to understand that the conflict between his parents and me wasn't about him. It was about the choices adults had made. "Daddy was wrong to say you weren't my grandma," he told me one afternoon as we worked on a puzzle together. "You've always been my grandma." "That's right, sweetheart." "And Mommy was wrong not to tell him to stop being mean." "Yes, she was." "Are they sorry?" I considered how to answer honestly, without being cruel. "I think they're sorry they're in trouble. But I don't think they understand yet why what they did was wrong." "Will they ever understand?" "I don't know, Michael. Some people take a very long time to learn important lessons. Some people never learn them at all. But you'll still be my grandma no matter what. Forever and always." Meanwhile, Mark and Sarah's public ordeal continued. They had completed 8 months of their year-long commitment, but their progress was minimal. The community service hours were being fulfilled, but grudgingly. The advocacy work was being done, but without conviction. The financial audit was complete, revealing a pattern of ethical lapses that had effectively ended Mark's career in insurance. Their marriage, already strained, was showing signs of complete breakdown. They were sleeping in separate bedrooms, communicating only when necessary, and blaming each other for their situation with increasing bitterness. "If you had just stood up to your mother at the beginning," Mark said during one of their arguments that I witnessed while dropping Michael off after a visit. "If you had just told her to mind her own business. If you hadn't been a complete bastard to an old woman at a children's picnic, none of this would have happened." Sarah screamed back. Their voices carried clearly through the thin walls of their apartment, and I could see Michael's shoulders tense as he heard his parents fighting yet again. It was during this period that I made a crucial decision. Michael's inheritance needed to be protected not just from his parents' potential mismanagement, but from the ongoing trauma of this family conflict. I met with Eleanor to restructure the inheritance completely. "I want to create an unconditional trust for Michael," I told her. "Something that will provide for his education, his health, and his well-being regardless of what his parents do or don't do." That's a significant change from the original conditions. The original conditions were designed to teach Mark and Sarah a lesson, but they're proving incapable of learning. Michael shouldn't continue to suffer because his parents are stubborn and selfish. What about the money they think they're working toward? They can continue their public performance for as long as they choose, but the outcome will be the same regardless. They'll never have access to my fortune because they've proven themselves unworthy of it. So the conditions become meaningless? No. The conditions serve their purpose. They expose Mark and Sarah's true character to the world. They demonstrate the consequences of cruelty. They provide a public lesson about respect and dignity. Whether they fulfill them or not is irrelevant to Michael's future security. The new trust was established within 2 weeks, with provisions that would ensure Michael's education through graduate school, provide for any medical needs, and offer him a substantial but not overwhelming inheritance when he reached 30. More importantly, the trust included provisions for his emotional well-being, ongoing therapy if needed, support for maintaining relationships with extended family, and protection from any attempts by his parents to manipulate or control him through financial means. Michael will be taken care of, I told Dr. Martinez during one of our sessions. Regardless of what happens with his parents, his future is secure. And how do you feel about that? Peaceful. For the first time since this all began, I feel genuinely peaceful. I've protected my grandson. I've demonstrated that cruelty has consequences, and I've ensured that love ultimately triumphs over greed. What about Mark and Sarah? I considered the question carefully. They've chosen their path. They've had every opportunity to demonstrate genuine remorse, to show real change, to prove themselves worthy of trust and respect. They've chosen instead to endure their punishment without learning from it. That's their choice to make. Do you think they'll ever change? I think some people are incapable of genuine change because they're fundamentally unable to see beyond their own wants and needs. Mark and Sarah are those kinds of people. And you've made peace with that? I've made peace with doing everything in my power to protect Michael and to ensure that cruelty has consequences. The rest is up to them. As their year of public penance drew to a close, Mark and Sarah's situation had deteriorated beyond what anyone could have imagined. Their marriage was effectively over, though they remained legally married for financial reasons. Mark had been unable to find steady employment due to his tarnished reputation. Sarah's advocacy work had become a source of mockery rather than respect. Most devastating of all, they were about to discover that their year of humiliation had been for nothing. I called them to my house on a cold November evening, exactly 11 months after that disastrous family dinner. They arrived separately, Mark driving his aging sedan. The luxury car had been repossessed months earlier. Sarah taking an Uber because her car was in the shop and they couldn't afford the repairs. They looked like different people from the confident, attractive couple who had walked into my dining room a year ago. Mark had lost weight in an unhealthy way, his face gaunt and his expensive clothes hanging loosely on his frame. Sarah looked older, her blonde hair showing dark roots she could no longer afford to touch up, her skin pale and drawn with stress. "Thank you for coming," I said, leading them into the same dining room where this had all begun. "Are we finally done with this nightmare?" Mark asked without preamble. "We've completed almost all of the requirements. The community service, the advocacy work, the public humiliation, all of it." The public apology was aired on 3 television stations and published in the newspaper as required, Sarah added, her voice flat with exhaustion. "The financial audit is complete. I've given dozens of speeches about grandparents' rights. We've done everything you asked." "Yes," I agreed. "You have fulfilled the technical requirements of the conditions." Relief flooded their faces. After a year of public humiliation, they thought their ordeal was finally over. "So, we can access Michael's inheritance now?" Mark asked eagerly. "The $33 million? I walked to the sideboard and retrieved a new set of documents. "I'm afraid there's been a change." The relief vanished instantly, replaced by wariness and growing alarm. "What kind of change?" Sarah whispered. "The $33 million is now held in an unconditional trust that will provide for his education, health, and well-being. You will never have access to it." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, rage. "You can't do that," he snarled. "We had an agreement. We fulfilled your conditions. You fulfilled the technical requirements, yes. But you learned nothing from the experience. You showed no genuine remorse. You demonstrated no real change in character. We did everything you asked. Sarah was crying now, tears of frustration and despair. Everything. We humiliated ourselves in public. We worked with those damaged children. We exposed our private finances to the world. Yes, you did all of those things. Reluctantly, resentfully, and without a shred of genuine understanding about why they were necessary. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is fraud. This is elder abuse. We'll sue you, You'll what? I asked calmly. Take me to court and explain to a judge why you believe you're entitled to money that was never yours? Describe how you told an 8-year-old child that his grandmother wasn't his grandmother. One mistake, Mark shouted. You destroyed our lives over one mistake. It wasn't a mistake, I replied quietly. It was a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice to be cruel to an innocent child. And in the year since then, you've made dozens of other choices that revealed your true character. What choices? Sarah demanded. The choice to go through the motions of community service without ever genuinely caring about the children you were supposed to help. The choice to deliver speeches about grandparents' rights without ever acknowledging the irony of your position. The choice to blame me for your situation instead of taking responsibility for your actions. We took responsibility, Mark protested. We did everything you required. You endured punishment. That's not the same as taking responsibility. I walked to the window and looked out at the garden where Arthur and I had spent so many happy hours. Do you know what genuine responsibility would have looked like? It would have meant coming to me immediately after the picnic and apologizing sincerely. It would have meant explaining to Michael that what happened was wrong and that you were sorry. It would have meant making changes in your behavior without being forced to do so. But we did apologize. You read scripted words on television because you wanted access to money. That's not an apology. That's a performance. So this was all for nothing? Sarah's voice was broken, defeated. The entire year was pointless? Not pointless, I corrected. Educational. You've shown the world exactly who you are. You've demonstrated that some people are incapable of genuine growth or change. You've provided a public lesson about the consequences of cruelty. And what about us? Mark asked. What about our lives? Our future? Our marriage? Your marriage was clearly failing long before I imposed any conditions. Your financial problems stemmed from your own poor choices and questionable business practices. Your social isolation is the result of people seeing your true character. You destroyed everything, Sarah screamed. I revealed everything, I replied. There's a difference. They sat in stunned silence for several minutes, the full weight of their situation finally sinking in. A year of public humiliation for nothing. A year of damaged relationships, lost business, and social isolation that had gained them exactly nothing. Please, Mark said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. We have nothing left. No money, no business, no friends. Sarah's already filed for divorce. I'm going to lose the apartment. I'm going to be homeless. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you decided to emotionally abuse an 8-year-old child. It was 10 seconds, he exploded. 10 seconds of anger that have ruined our entire lives. 10 seconds that revealed the kind of people you really are. 10 seconds that showed you're capable of cruelty toward a child and an elderly woman. 10 seconds that demonstrated your complete lack of empathy or basic human decency. What do you want from us? Sarah sobbed. Blood? Our lives? Our souls? I wanted you to become better people. I wanted you to learn from your mistakes. I wanted you to show genuine remorse and real change. I turned to face them fully. But you're incapable of any of those things. So instead, you'll serve as an example to others about what happens when people choose cruelty over kindness. And Michael? Mark asked desperately. What about Michael? He's our son, Michael will be fine. His future is secure, his education is funded, and his emotional well-being is being carefully monitored. He's learning the difference between conditional love and unconditional love, between manipulation and genuine care. You're taking our son away from us. I'm protecting my grandson from people who have proven themselves capable of emotional cruelty toward children. People who would use a child as a pawn in their adult conflicts. Please, Sarah begged.
I'm sorry.
I'm truly sorry for what happened at the picnic. I'm sorry I didn't defend you. I'm sorry I smiled when Mark was being cruel. Please give us another chance. I looked at my daughter. This woman I had carried for 9 months, raised for 28 years, loved unconditionally until she showed me who she really was. Are you sorry because you understand the pain you caused? Or are you sorry because you're facing consequences? She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. The silence was answer enough. That's what I thought. I walked to the front door and opened it. I think it's time for you to leave. They gathered their things slowly, moving like people in shock. At the door, Mark turned back to me one last time. This isn't over, he said, though there was no real threat in his voice anymore. Just the empty bluster of a defeated man. Yes, I replied calmly. It is. I watched them walk to their separate vehicles, two people whose lives had been permanently altered by 10 seconds of cruelty at a family picnic. Part of me wondered if I should feel pity for them, but I found that I didn't. They had made their choices. Now they would live with the consequences. 2 years have passed since that final confrontation in my dining room. I am now 60, and I have built a life that exceeds anything I could have imagined when Arthur was alive. Not because of the money, though financial security is certainly a blessing, but because of the peace that comes from knowing I protected someone who couldn't protect himself. Michael is 10 now, a bright, thoughtful boy who visits me every weekend. The therapy has helped him process the trauma of his parents' conflict, and while he still loves his mother and father, he understands that their choices have consequences. Grandma, he asked me recently as we worked in the garden together, do you think Mommy and Daddy will ever say they're really sorry? I don't know, sweetheart. Some people find it very hard to admit when they're wrong. But you're not mad at them anymore? I considered the question carefully. I'm not angry, Michael. I'm sad that they chose to be the kind of people who would hurt others. But I'm not angry. Do you think they love me? I think they love you as much as they're capable of loving anyone. But their love comes with conditions. They expect you to do things that make them happy, even if those things aren't good for you. And your love doesn't have conditions?
Never.
Nothing you could ever do would make me love you less. Nothing you could ever say would change how I feel about you. That's what unconditional love means. Mark never recovered from his public disgrace. His insurance business was permanently destroyed, and his reputation made it impossible for him to find comparable employment. He currently works as a night security guard at a shopping mall, living in a studio apartment across town. The divorce from Sarah was finalized 8 months ago, and they share custody of Michael, though their interactions are limited to necessary communications about schedules and school events. Sarah has struggled as well, though she's shown more resilience than Mark. She completed a nursing program using financial aid and now works at a rehabilitation center for elderly patients. The irony of her caring for the demographic she helped abuse is not lost on anyone, but she seems to find some measure of redemption in the work. Whether that redemption is genuine or simply another performance is unclear. They never speak to me unless absolutely necessary for Michael's sake. At school events or sporting activities where we might encounter each other, they maintain a careful distance, avoiding eye contact and conversation. The few times our paths have crossed, I've been polite but distant, treating them with the courtesy I would show any acquaintances, nothing more. The media attention has finally died down, though our story occasionally resurfaces as an example of how family conflicts can spiral out of control. A family therapist wrote a book about the case, calling it a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of brief moments of cruelty. A documentary filmmaker approached me about telling the story, but I declined. Some stories are better left in the past. Michael's trust fund has grown substantially under careful management and will provide him with opportunities his parents could never have given him, even with access to my original fortune. He'll attend the best schools, have access to the finest healthcare, and inherit enough money at 30 to live comfortably for the rest of his life. More importantly, he's surrounded by people who love him unconditionally and who are teaching him the difference between right and wrong. My prayer group from Grace Methodist still meets weekly, and they've become some of my closest friends. These women understand that sometimes love requires boundaries, that sometimes protecting the innocent means punishing the guilty, and that sometimes the most Christian thing you can do is ensure that cruelty has consequences. You did the right thing, Margaret Foster told me just last week. That boy needed someone to fight for him, someone to show him that family doesn't mean accepting abuse. Do you ever regret it? Asked Patricia Chen. The public nature of it all. The media attention?
No, irreplí honestly.
If we had handled this privately, Mark and Sarah would have learned nothing. They would have apologized when it was convenient and returned to their old behavior when they thought no one was watching. The public nature of their consequences was the only thing that made them real. But perhaps the most satisfying part of my current life is the work I've been able to do with my resources. I've established a foundation that provides legal support for grandparents fighting for visitation rights. I've funded programs that help elderly people who have been abandoned or abused by their families. I've created scholarships for children from broken homes who need additional support to succeed academically. The Robb Foundation, named in honor of Arthur and managed in memory of what our family could have been, has helped hundreds of families navigate difficult situations with dignity and legal protection. We don't publicize our work extensively. We simply do what needs to be done, quietly and effectively. Your husband would be proud, Eleanor Vance told me during our last meeting to review the Foundation's progress. You've turned your pain into purpose, your anger into action. Arthur always said I was stronger than I knew. I think he would be pleased that I finally figured out how to use that strength. Last month, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Sarah, handwritten on simple stationery, and it was the first personal communication I'd received from her since that final confrontation 2 years ago. Mother, it began, I know I have no right to write to you, and I don't expect you to respond. But I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about what happened, about the choices I made, about the person I was. Working with elderly patients has taught me things I wish I had understood years ago. I see the pain in their eyes when their families abandon them, the hope they feel when someone shows them kindness, the dignity they maintain even when their bodies fail them. I understand now what we did to you that day at the picnic. I understand the cruelty of it, the calculated nature of it, the way we used Michael as a weapon against you. I understand why you did what you did, and I understand that forgiveness isn't something I can ask for. I don't expect reconciliation. I don't expect another chance. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand the difference between being sorry because you're caught and being sorry because you've hurt someone you should have protected. Michael talks about you every day. He loves you so much, and I'm grateful that he has you in his life. You've given him something Mark and I couldn't: unconditional love and the security of knowing that at least one adult in his life will always put his welfare first. I hope you're happy. I hope you found peace. And I hope that someday, when Michael is old enough to understand everything that happened, he'll know that even when families break apart, love can still triumph. Your daughter, Sarah, I never responded to the letter. Some conversations are meant to be one-sided. Some apologies are meant to be given without expectation of reply. Sarah's letter wasn't seeking forgiveness. It was offering understanding. And that understanding, however late in coming, was enough. The real victory wasn't in their punishment or their public humiliation. The real victory was in Michael's laughter when he runs through my garden, in his excited phone calls when he gets good grades at school, in his absolute certainty that he is loved unconditionally by at least one person in this world. "Grandma," he said to me last Sunday as we sat on the porch swing watching the sunset, "when I grow up, I want to be like you." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Strong."
And kind.
"But mostly strong." "You're already both of those things, Michael." "Will you always be my grandma?" "Forever and always." "Even when I'm old like you?" I laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the garden where Arthur and I had once planned our future together. "Even when you're old like me." As I write this, sitting in the same study where I planned my response to Mark and Sarah's cruelty 3 years ago, I can hear Michael in the kitchen helping prepare dinner. He's staying with me this weekend while his parents attend some court-mandated co-parenting class, another consequence of their choices that continues to ripple through their lives. But he's not here because his parents are in trouble. He's here because this is his home too. Because love isn't about blood relations or legal obligations. Love is about showing up, standing up, and never giving up on the people who matter most. They thought they could break me with 10 seconds of cruelty at a family picnic. They thought they could dismiss me as a harmless old woman whose feelings didn't matter. They thought they could use my grandson as a weapon against me and walk away unscathed. They were wrong about all of it. I am Michelle Robb, and I am exactly where I belong. I am powerful, purposeful, and at peace. I've built a legacy not of money, but of love. Not of revenge, but of justice. Not of cruelty, but of consequences. Mark and Sarah taught me something valuable that day at the picnic, that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who show us exactly who we're meant to become. I was meant to be Michael's protector. I was meant to be a voice for the voiceless. I was meant to show the world that cruelty toward the vulnerable has consequences. And I was meant to prove that a grandmother's love is the most powerful force in the universe, stronger than greed, more enduring than cruelty, and more transformative than any amount of money. This is my story. This is my journey. This is my victory. And it's far from over. And that, my beautiful souls, is the power of a grandmother's love and an unbreakable spirit. Michelle's journey reminds us that sometimes the cruelest betrayals come from those closest to us, but they also reveal exactly how strong we really are. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of consequence and unconditional love, then you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Share this with every woman in your life who needs to remember that her love is a force to be reckoned with, that her voice matters, and that standing up for what's right is always worth it. Drop a comment below and let me know what part of Michelle's story resonated most with you. Remember, your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. It's determined by how you respond to that treatment. Until next time, stay strong, stay loving, and remember, your journey is just beginning. Welcome to Her True Stories, where every woman's voice matters.